changed the plan. It wasn't a big change. Maybe just the restaurant you were going to go to closed early, and so you choose a new one. Or maybe the play date got moved from today to tomorrow. Or maybe you just took a different route home. But all of a sudden, your child, who was fine 60 seconds ago, is now melting down. They are completely falling apart. And you're trying to explain to them that, like, this is not that big of a deal. This happens. Life happens, and flexibility is part of life. But the more you explain, the worse it gets. And you end up with a full blown meltdown over something seemingly insignificant. My name's Bethany Haney. Thanks for joining us here on the Kairos Bridge. We are in a multi-part series on executive function, and today is part 5, where we are talking about cognitive flexibility. What I want you to know is that your child is not being stubborn. The thing is that their brain has already committed to a mental map of how things are going to go. And when the map changed, their brain had to do something that it's not very good at. It had to throw out the old map and then draw up a new one in real time under pressure. That requires cognitive flexibility. And for a developing brain, that is genuinely difficult work. So what is cognitive flexibility? Well, it's one of the 11 executive functions we're talking about. But it's the ability to adjust our thinking and our behavior in response to a change in circumstances. It's like the mental gear shift that allows you to move from one task to another, to adapt to new information, and then to see a solution from a new perspective so that you can let go of the expectation when reality asks for something different. Now, researchers call the difficulty with cognitive flexibility perseveration. And perseveration is the tendency to get stuck on a thought, a plan, or a way of doing things, even when it no longer works or no longer serves us or isn't even possible. Perseveration is not stubbornness. It's the brain's default mode when the flexibility circuitry is underdeveloped or overwhelmed. The brain locks into the original map and cannot release it without significant cognitive effort. And that significant cognitive effort, it's expensive, like energy-wise. It is exhausting to transition from what the brain thought it was going to do to a new plan. And so that is even more difficult with a brain that hasn't learned cognitive flexibility yet. Think about it. Every transition from one activity to another costs mental energy. From one environment to another costs mental energy. From the expected to the unexpected also costs significant energy and a requirement to rethink and adapt to the new way of being. That requires the brain to disengage from what it thought it was going to do, what it was doing, update its internal mode of what's happening, and then re-engage into something new. That's a 3-step cognitive operation. And for the developing brain of a child, especially one that is already committed to a plan that they emotionally were very tied to, it can feel almost impossible. Now, cognitive flexibility also shows up in social contexts, not just contexts where our own personal life has changed and it's just something we have to fix, but in the context of like showing up in a room and being able to read that room and adjust your behavior based off of who's there and what's going on, what the situation requires. That's a flexibility skill, is reading the room. Then seeing someone else's perspective rather than being locked into your own perspective, that's a flexibility skill required in social settings. Also, problem solving. When the first approach is tried and doesn't work, and then you have to pivot to a new approach, especially in team dynamics, again, that is a social skill that requires flexible thinking. This is why children with cognitive flexibility gaps often struggle socially, because they can't shift their mental frame fast enough from, well, we were going to be playing kickball at recess, but the ball is flat, so now we have to play tag. They may be exceedingly upset by that because they were looking forward to playing kickball all day long. How do they shift their mind to find enjoyment in this new thing? That they struggle to shift their mental frame fast enough to navigate the constantly changing landscape of peer relationships because they're already struggling to navigate their own disappointment. How do they navigate the disappointment with other people involved? This is a skill that can be developed, and we're going to talk about from a practical perspective, what can we do as parents to help build this cognitive flexibility? But before we do that, I want to take a look at the scripture because we can see examples of cognitive flexibility throughout. Specifically, when we look at Acts 16, it gives us a picture of this in action in the context of following God's leading rather than the disciples' own plan. So Paul and his companions set out with a very clear plan. They were going to preach in Asia. The Spirit prevented them. The Spirit of God stepped in and was like, nope. They tried to go to the city that they thought that they were called to, Bithynia, and the Spirit prevented them again. Every plan changed. Every map had to be redrawn. And in the night that Paul received a vision redirecting them entirely to Macedonia, it was not an original part of the plan. It was completely different, a completely different direction and a completely different mission. But they set out immediately. They didn't argue. They didn't spiral. They didn't demand that God explain himself before they would move. They adjusted. They redrew the map. They followed the new direction with the same commitment that they had when they had bought into the original plan. That's an example of cognitive flexibility in the service of a fixed purpose that God has called us to. The destination, the mission that God gave them, never changed. The bigger picture mission was the same. Still, go make disciples. But the route to get there is what changed repeatedly. And the ability for Paul and the disciples to hold on to the purpose steadily while releasing the plan is the exact skill that we are trying to develop in our children. Now, let's be honest and pause here, because even as adults, some of us don't do this very well. I can say that God has given me an idea and I have this map, and I don't like when the map changes or when the map doesn't go the way that I want it to go. But I have to remind myself that it's the overall vision and purpose that matters, less so how I get there. And for all I know, my path to get there wasn't going to be very good. And so maybe in God's grace, he's given a new path. Sometimes in the same way, children can't see the bigger picture. And so sometimes we need to provide some of the encouragement and the perspective to help them understand that. And so I offer that from our perspective because it's worth noting that this kind of cognitive flexibility, releasing our grip on how we expect things to go, is actually one of the most spiritually formative practices available to us as adults. Because how many times has God redirected our plans? How many times has the route changed while the destination was still the same? Have we been able to trust the redirector more than the map itself? Because that's not only an executive function skill, that's a spiritual practice. And we can teach our kids to do the same, because the same may be happening in parenthood. Maybe we thought parenthood, raising children was going to look one way, and the map has taken a very different direction. The goal is still the same. And so when we show our children that we are able to release the control and the expectations of how we thought things were going to go and to adapt to it, it sets the example for how our children also learn to live and adapt. When they see us being adaptable and accommodating, they then learn to do the same. Because children learn through social emotional learning, which basically means they watch us and they emulate what we've done. Children are giant mirrors, and I say that gently because when I say it, I always get a reaction from the room where people are like, whoa, but it's so true. Whatever we see in them, we have to ask, where are they learning that? And how do I change what they're learning to get from them what I know is going to be an essential life skill? So this is what brings us to our parenting practice. Notice it, name it, nurture it. First, notice it. Before you talk your child through a change, notice what or where they are in the process of shifting. Have they heard what the change in the plan is, but they haven't processed it yet? Are they in the middle of grieving the original plan? Because that is real grief. Even if the thing seems small to us as adults, to them, a play date is everything. And to tell them like it's moving to tomorrow feels like a big deal. So then they're thinking like, well, then what do I do today? Or maybe they've already gone through, they've heard it, they've processed it, they've grieved it, and they're starting to adjust. They just need a little moment for that transition to complete itself. So notice where they are in the process, but also notice what triggers them. Because if you can start to anticipate, what is it that typically triggers a child? Is it a change in errands? Do a change in errands typically trigger them? Okay, then that's going to change how we position the change in errands. Does a change in food typically trigger them? Does a change in activity typically trigger them? Does a change in plans to meet up with friends typically trigger them? Does a change in the bedtime routine typically trigger them? Whatever change in plans is a typical trigger for them, you'll want to pay attention to that. And some of it goes back to their temperament. If you've not watched that episode previously on the YouTube channel, it's worth going back to listen to, because depending on your child's one of four temperaments determines how affected they are around by the world around them and the changes to that world. And you can start to anticipate what matters to them. Your blue melancholic child cares about space, silence, time. And so when we rush those blue children, it triggers a meltdown. Our yellow children are all about fun and energy. And so when we have taken away fun or energy, they melt down. Our red children are all about control and order. And so if we go from a plan that had a lot of control and order to a plan that does not, they start to melt down. And then our green child is very much so about low stress, harmony, but also respect. And so if we make a change in plans and it seems to them like we've not consulted them or considered their perspective, or it results in a high stress change, that really can cause them to trigger or melt down. And so temperament is really helpful for figuring out what a child's response might be in the absence of cognitive flexibility. The other thing to notice also is our own response to their inflexibility. So the parent who meets their own rigid, their own child with rigid expectations and judgment is often the same parent who struggles to extend patience to the child whose brain is doing the same thing. And so, like, if we are rigid in our expectations and we don't like things changing, and then our child melts down, I mean, we now are a dysregulated adult trying to regulate a dysregulated child, and two dysregulations don't add up to a regulation. Versus cognitive flexibility actually runs in families. It is a nurtured skill that gets passed down from the parent to the child, both neurologically and relationally. And so the best that we can do is start to notice, am I cognitively flexible? Okay, let's move on to name it. That's the second step in the process. So this gives the flexibility gap a name without making it a character trait or a verdict on their identity. So not saying things like, you are so stubborn, but I know that your brain had already planned for the other restaurant, and it's hard when plans change. That empathy and naming helps give the child hope. And again, remember, it's that verbal grounding that allows the processing of the emotion out of the limbic system so that the prefrontal cortex has room to take over. Also, it's not saying things like, oh, this is not a big deal, get over it. Because to their brain, it is a big deal. And when we dismiss the size of a transition, or really dismiss anything in their brains, that doesn't make the transition easier. It actually makes the transition harder. It adds shame to an already difficult cognitive task. So always taking it from a position of like, I know that this was not the plan. Unfortunately, the plan has changed. I'm frustrated. I can see that you're frustrated. How do we make the best of this situation? That actually starts to invite them into the nurturing where they can help problem solve, and it gets their problem solving mind in gear. And so by naming this skill directly, saying things like, changing plans is something that your brain still has to get better at. Let's figure out how to help it shift. That sentence actually does three things. It validates the difficulty, it removes the shame, and then it opens the door for coaching them through the problem solving. And then that's where nurture it starts. So this is how you build cognitive flexibility and scaffolding around it. So first of all, give transition warnings. When you know that the play date is coming to an end and it's about to be time to leave, give them a 5-minute warning. Or if your child needs longer, give them 10. It allows that neurologic preparation, and it allows the brain to begin to disengage from the current state and prepare for the shift. It's also a great way to have them start cleaning up their own mess. Like, okay, 10-minute warning, choose your last activity you want to play with before we start cleaning up. So then they have a choice over their last activity because children love to retain power. I mean, all humans love to retain power. Who are we kidding? But then when the 5-minute warning comes, they don't feel abruptly rushed into cleaning up because their brain already knows that the cleanup time was coming. And then that allows them, especially the child who has a significant flexibility gap already in their thinking, that warning is helpful to be able to say to their brain, like, okay, this is what's coming next. And not only is it helpful in that moment, it starts to build the cognitive flexibility. As their brain starts to learn, I'm going to transition from this task to this task, it starts to lay down a new neural pathway that they then get used to. Now, another thing that you can do to help nurture it is honor the original plan before introducing the new one. So say something like, I know we were going to go to the pizza place tonight, and that was a good plan. However, I didn't realize that it's closed on Mondays, so we need to make a new plan. What if we go to the taco place instead? And so now you're acknowledging the original mental map before ripping it away and asking the brain to release it. The acknowledgement actually reduces the resistance because the brain no longer has to fight for something that originally mattered to them. The brain already knows that you know that it mattered. Third, practice flexibility in low stakes moments. So play a game where maybe the rules change, or read books about characters that are navigating unexpected changes. Talk about a time when you had to change your own plan and how you handled it, even though it was disappointing. The reason to do this is because flexibility is a muscle. It gets stronger with practice in safe, low stakes contexts, and it gives the brain a pathway that it can already follow when the stakes get high. And then finally, when the transition is particularly hard, name the feeling underneath the rigidity. Say you look angry, you look sad, you look hurt, you look frustrated. Often cognitive inflexibility is fueled by anxiety, which is actually the cover up for fear. They fear the unknown. They fear what they don't know is coming. And so it turns into anxiety, and anxiety turns into control, and control turns into a meltdown. And so the brain can't let go of the original plan because it's afraid of what's going to come. And so if you address the anxiety alongside the flexibility gap, it actually opens the door for both because you speak into that fear and then it exits so that you can replace it with assurance of what is to come. In closing, I want to leave you with this. Your child is not being stubborn. Their brain is committed to an original map, and releasing that map is actually hard work. Your job as a parent is not to dismiss the difficulty or demand instant flexibility. It's to give the brain time to shift, to honor what it has to release, and then to gently coach the child into gear shifting, because then that makes transitions easier in the future. Paul didn't argue with God when the plan changed. God didn't argue with Paul. Paul adjusted. And with practice and patient coaching, your child can learn to do the same. Now, in the next episode, we're going to tackle the topic of sustained attention. Why can your child focus for hours on things they love, like Legos or craft activities, but they can't pay attention for 15 minutes to homework? And then what does that actually tell you about how their brain works? That's what's coming next. If today helped you understand your child's transitions differently, then please share it with a friend. And if you find that you might need to go deeper on this topic, I am always available at thekairosbridge.com. I love walking with and working alongside families to understand the specifics of where their child might be struggling and the parenting practices that you can put in place to address it. Until next time, be well.